I'm Audrey Hebert. I'm one of the co-chairs of Sophia's Religious Leaders Caucus. And each year in November, we put a program on for the community at large. And we try to pick topics that are very relevant. Recently with COVID, of course, we've gone to Zoom, which has changed the character a little bit, but we still are finding this to be a very positive experience. And so I'd like to welcome you all for joining us today. If you have feedback at the end, we'd be happy to hear it. And I'm just so glad that you could join us today. At this point, I would like to introduce the co-chair of the Sophia Religious Leaders Caucus, which is Reverend Jim Holmberg. And Jim will lead us in an opening devotion this morning.
Thank you, Audrey. Good morning, everyone. Very good to be with you today. One of the things that I've noticed in the last weeks, days, or more, is that whenever I've talked to friends and colleagues and others around, the conversation has gone something like, you know, I'm really afraid about the elections coming up. I've got some, I'm really fearful of what might happen. And I've said it myself to friends on emails and in meetings and in passing conversation. You know, I'm really afraid. Fear was expressed in a lot of different ways, and whether it be the outcome of the election one way or another on various races, or whether it be the safety of the process and the validity and of the entire voting process itself. You know, all of those things were expressed in terms of fear and anxiety. And of course, that's a big part of our life, especially in the last few years. I think anxiety has increased manyfold, and that's a big part of our lives in the political process and the life of faith and life of our social justice issues. But then I thought back to a gift that I got from my brother when I was in college. And my oldest brother was 15 years older than me, and he was not a person who expressed his faith in any organized fashion in a congregation at all, or did those kind of things, but he was extremely well read. And he also knew that I was going to seminary and respected that, and was thinking of what to give me as a gift. And so one year, I think for Christmas, he gave me a small wooden plaque. And it was a kind of a weathered piece of lumber with a wood burning on it. If you remember, wood burning was a little more popular in the 70s and, you know, through that period. And on it was the simple scripture phrase, "Be still and know that I am God." Well, it was meaningful to me. I was glad my brother gave me that. And it was a piece that I kept right in my room, by my bed, for years and years and years. And often I would look at that in the morning or at night after a day full of anxiety and uncertainty and what's going to happen next. And I would read that, "Be still and know that I am God." It's from Psalm 46, verse 10, I believe. And so that's a scripture that's been important to me for a long time. But it's not something that we as a people often do well. We are not easily still. We are people of movement and fluttering all over the place. We love to scat here and there, and we love to do this and check off our lists at the end of the day, or look at them at the beginning of the day and wonder, what can I accomplish today? Where can I go? What can I do? And all of this. And that Psalm 46, the entire Psalm, is a psalm of calm and anxiety and strength and of safety in God. And then it comes to this really third part of that psalm, which says, be still, be still. And stillness is something that we need to practice even this morning as we look at elections and wonder about this or that, or the outcome of what will happen next and what's going to come of us as a people. And we are still full of anxiety. And yet, I think I share that scripture today as part of our reflection. Be still and know that I am God. As I also looked at that and looked at some other people who've shared that thoughts around Psalm 46, I found another short piece by Parker Palmer. Parker, of course, comes from the Quaker tradition, as I understand it, which has a much more focused sense of stillness and waiting. You know, I would have trouble being a Quaker because, you know, it's just not part of my nature. But I think as you continue in that tradition, maybe it does become easier for you. He shared some time ago a poem by Pablo Neruda. It is called Keeping Quiet. Pablo writes, now we will count to 12 and we will all keep still for once on the face of the earth. Let's not speak any language. Let's stop for a second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment, without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would not look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victories with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Now, I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go. So I thank Parker Palmer for that, sharing that poem, and for Pablo for writing it, and for the God who reminds us to be still, to be still. So let that be your gift this day as we share thoughts and discussions and stories of what it means to be people of faith, living in the world where we work towards social justice. Amen. Well, as we begin today, I get the great joy of introducing the Reverend Libby Howe. Hey! It is very exciting to have her today. Her title is the Congregational Support Coordinator for Peace and Justice Ministries of the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Reverend Howe was ordained in 2002 in the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She served 2 congregations in DeSoto and Ferryville, Wisconsin for 6.5 years. And then she was director for evangelical mission and assistant to the bishop in the La Crosse area synod for more than 12 years, where I got to know her some years ago. And she wore many different hats in that office and in working with congregations involving congregational transitions, conflict management, of which there is none in the church. So she was quiet, pastoral care for leaders, and stewardship. And she, of course, is passionate about working for peace and justice, and that's what drew her, I'm sure, to this work with the Wisconsin Council of Churches. So she works with leaders and congregations to become more love-focused and in communities working for peace and justice. So it is with great excitement that we welcome you today, Pastor Libby, to our group. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jim, and thank you for welcoming me here into this gathering this morning. I really appreciate that devotion as well. Anytime I'm set to present, I always get a little bit anxious or nervous. So those words about being still and knowing that God is God, and that we all hear that together just reminds me that that of course it doesn't all depend on me. We're going to have a good morning together as we consider and share thoughts about the relationship between faith and justice. I do have a few slides, maybe 12 or 13 to share. And so I'm going to be sort of sharing, and at one point we'll watch about 6 minutes of a video of a voice that I think is very important right now as we consider the relationship between faith and justice. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end, and maybe even more than a little, to just do some thoughtful reflection with one another. I think we're a small enough group that we can do that as a whole instead of needing to go into breakout groups. And it will be beneficial to hear what some of your responses are to some of the things that I've said. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll get going with our presentation. We'll do share sound, optimize, and I will share, and I will make sure that we can. I'm going to hide these floating meeting controls because they drive me crazy. I'm going to view. Actually, we're going to go from here, from beginning. So can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. So while I'm, oh goodness, I have the title spelled wrong. I have to fix that. I can't let that just go. Hang on. That's terrible. Here we go. Okay, better. Okay. Let's see if I can, is there a way? Let's see, from current slide. So what is the relationship between faith and justice? And like you said, this is for today, and I'm with the Wisconsin Council of Churches. So a few months back, I saw this this meme on on Facebook, and I posted it. Is this a social justice church? And Marcus Holly says to me, that's like saying, is this a book library or a food grocery store? And I thought of some other things we might ask. Is this hamburgers and French fries McDonald's, or is this an animal zoo? Is this a tree forest? Is this a teaching learning school? Is this an overpriced big candy movie theater? Is this a haircut barbershop? Is this a water ocean? And I just started playing with all the things we could say that about, but that's how that feels to me too. We are a church, and because we follow Christ, we're called, among other things, to pursue justice, which is to say, justice and faith can't not go together. So there's always a little bit of a challenge in saying, so what is the relationship? Because I feel like it's just so obvious. Now I have to figure out why that is and sort of piece that out a little bit for it. So this was a great invitation to think more deeply about why this is so true for me, that these things can't be separated. And I recognize that I'm coming out of a tradition. I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor, as Jim said, that has not always had the best of histories when it comes to, in fact, we've really done a lot to not promote justice, especially as a Western Christian tradition. And so somewhere along the line, I had to ask myself, why did that happen to you? And I do think it's because of different voices that have reminded me of who Jesus is. And so Marcus Halley's words here, because we follow Christ. And so that centrality of who Jesus is. We can't get to know who Jesus is and what Jesus was about without looking at the ways he talked about and embodied the work of justice and peace for the world. So I like definitions. I'm a word person, like many pastors are. So I want to first talk a little bit about faith. What are some of the things I think about faith? So the first is that faith is, there's sort of the faith, the big, like when I can talk with people who share my vernacular, my history, my tradition, I can say we share the faith. And I mean this particular construct and a worldview that's been handed down from generation to generation. And it responds to the big questions like, where did we come from? Who are we? What are we doing here? Where are we going? What does this all mean? How should we live? Like there's sort of this big mass of big questions that I think the faith that we share as Christians, but even the faith that other traditions share, still going and working toward getting at these kinds of questions that that humans ask. I think elephants might ask them too, with the research we know about them. But I know for sure humans ask these questions. Then there is also my faith, and that's more obviously more personal, and those are sort of they are related very much to the faith as something that I've caught and been brought up in my life. But they become, as we grow, convictions that are born of my own experiences, both within and outside of religious practice. So in that way, my faith is a lens through which I view the world. And I started to think about, well, how would you tell somebody about your faith? And so I thought I should probably do that with you today. And the first part of my faith is Jesus. And I didn't have time to detail all the things I'm going to say here. If you would like some of my notes, I can make them available to you afterwards. But Jesus is so central to how I think about faith, and to my faith, that there's a relationship, and the person of Jesus. The most important thing about Jesus that I think is significant when sharing our faith with others is what I learned in seminary is called the scandal of particularity. Meaning that if God could come into the world 2,000 years ago in a tiny village through a teenage woman, and I mean, it's just so preposterous. I mean, when I think about, are we really saying this about the divine creator of the universe? And yes, we absolutely are. That's something that random and that particular is who and how our God shows up in our lives. Because only a God that does that then and through and with Jesus can do that now with us. So in order for me to believe a personal relationship with God is real, that's how I know, because I am just as random. I am just as particular, as are you and every other person and situation that we have. So that's just such a huge part of what I find myself when people say this might not be, even in moments of doubt. And I'm like, no, we can't dismiss every witness of God's presence and power for as long as it's happened in as many places and as many ways. And Jesus, the most significant of those ways for us. In and with the person of Jesus, we have both and in separateness of the human and the divine. My human tendency is I tend toward perfectionism and black and white thinking, and Jesus just mixes it all up all the time. And he makes sure that I do not look at the world. He helps me not be so either or with the whole thing. That is so critical. And especially as we think about how we work with people who are different than us, and how we relate to those who we find, sometimes, especially in the work of justice and peace, we really come up against the forces of what feels evil, working against the goodness and the well-being of the community, of the nation, of the world. And that means Jesus is both and human divine, means I can't ever say, so this is the sinner saint, I can't ever say someone is totally, completely condemned or evil or beautiful and saved. I feel like I can go 99% either way, but Jesus is going to keep me from going 100% either way. And most of the time, I hope I stay somewhere closer to the middle of that spectrum, both for myself and for others. So, and then finally, as Jesus is my salvation, that word, I think about that in terms of wholeness and healing, that in Jesus, God is reconciling the world to God's self, and that is both a particular effort as well as a cosmic one. That we're part of a huge project that God is working through and has invited us to be a part of, to bring the creation to something that looks more whole and more holy. So that's the first sort of conviction of faith. So start with Jesus, and then we have a God, and this is how I think I was a comparative religion major in college. And so one of the things I was looking at is how do humanity and God relate to one another? What's the articulation of that among different faiths in the world? And how do I, as a Christian, say who my God is? And what I came to was that there's just this insistent withness. God is with the humanity and the creation. One of my favorite songs when I was in high school was a song by that Bette Midler sang. It was called From a Distance. I mean, I loved that song. It was so like beautiful, and God is watching us, and God is, and then I thought, but that's actually not what we teach and believe about our God. God doesn't do this from a distance, and sure, it's beautiful from far away, but when God is with us, God gets into that messiness. And that's the insistence and the scandal again of, and what is so troubling about Christianity, I think for others who I've been in conversation with, is that God, in order for God to be holy, God must be wholly other and not get too close. And we even see those strains in our own faith, as far as, the way purity, the way we just don't want to get too, and there's parts of us that can get to thinking that if we get too messy, we might be finding our way away from God. And the fact is, in Christianity, we we proclaim it's the other way around. The next one, conviction of my faith, is that God is for us, not just with us, but actually cheering us on. And this is so central or so important in a world where I think we experience so much judgment and criticism, and quite honestly, a lot of meanness. And that a lot of people live in worlds and lives that are just kind of inhumane, whether they're in the corporate world or the healthcare world. That inhumanity, that cruelty, and then that gets superimposed onto our relationship with God. Well, that must be that's how our God is. And I think some of us grew up with a God that thought there was more of a pointing finger than a helping hand, that was encouraging us. And so just God being for humanity. God doesn't come into the world because God dislikes or is upset, like God comes in because God still believes in us, that we are so good and so loved and so worthy of God's love. And that's such good news, especially for people who feel like in the eyes of God, they're never worthy enough. Well, in fact, you are so worthy that God has given all for you. You are that important. And that's a message, that's a faith message that I think really comes into play when we're working for justice, because oftentimes that means we're working in systems of oppression or with people who are experiencing oppression, who are on the underside of life. And that's the conviction of faith that moves me, is to say, you're so worth it. And somebody has, we haven't done a good enough job of reminding you how good, how worthy you are. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Let's see if I can stop the share there. I'm going to get out of my thing here so I can. How did that happen? What happened? I know you can see me, but I don't know why my keyboard has stopped responding. So I'm going to I'm looking at you. I can see I have two different screens. So I'm now looking at you kind of on my upper screen, just so I don't waste your time in trying to figure out what's going on with my PowerPoint. But one of the questions, or I have a story to tell about that worthness, about God being for us. And it's from when I was a first call pastor in Ferryville, Wisconsin, which is a town of, like, on the sign it says 128, so pretty small place. And most of my congregation had some kind of tie to both the land and their families for generations. They had lived there for a long time, and this was especially true of the Lermo family, whose land was just adjacent to the church, and to the man who lived there, named Leslie. So one day, I was new. I mean, very early on, so it was over 20 years ago, and mornings are not my favorite time of the day. Do I have any other non-morning people? Yeah. So I had sort of one of the things that I realized is that because I had served two congregations and one of them had the office, I had more interaction with those people during the week, just sort of casually coming in and out. They would know I was there. Than I did with the folks at Freeman, which was the sort of out in the country on the hillside, no office. And so when I had Freeman as my early service, what started to happen, or even the late service, but anytime I got there, I just felt this crush of people on me right before I was ready to go into leading worship. And I really didn't like that, but I hadn't figured out that was happening or how to say that. So what I did sort of subconsciously was I started cutting it really close to when worship began. So I wouldn't have the time to deal with that. Everybody would know worship was starting and they would leave me alone. Well, a couple of times I cut it cut it too close. And I still am embarrassed to admit, I, as the pastor, was late for worship a few times when I first started. And one day I was so upset with myself for doing that, for letting that happen. And I walked into the church when I had to carry my robe from place to place. And it was the worst way to enter and to project any sense of calm and the beautiful man that welcomed me, his name was Charlie. He was so kind. He's like, "Oh, pastor, don't you worry about it. It happens to all of us." I mean, he just got it was so nice. And I looked at him and I said, "Charlie, don't tell me it's okay, because it's not okay. And I don't want to think it's okay." Like, I was like, "I don't want your forgiveness. Don't do that." So I walked in, everybody's sitting there stoically, just felt the judgment of all waiting for me. And I turned around and I actually relayed to them the conversation that had just happened in the narthex with Charlie, and said, "I love that there are those of you who would want to say that. But the truth is, I know it isn't okay. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again, and beg your forgiveness." And then we went into the confession and forgiveness, which seemed like a auspicious way to go at that point. We got through the service. I felt better. I mean, we did what we needed to do, and folks were shaking my hand on the way out. And one woman who'd been on my call committee and who was never shy about making her feelings known about everything going wrong with things. She shook my hand and she made sure that I knew that it was not okay with her, and that she would never tell me it was okay. And so then we were back to where it's sort of emotionally, I went back to that place where I had been at the beginning of the service. And she moved along, but yes, I registered her disappointment. And then Leslie Lermo, the man I mentioned earlier, he came through the line and he took my hand, and he was about 80 years old, and he was one of those Norwegians that I picture when people tell the jokes about Norwegians and how shy they are and how much they don't tell you what they think or what they feel. You know, he looks at someone else's shoes instead of his own because he's an extrovert. That's the man Leslie was. And I was so, oh my goodness, my heart just sank. I was so nervous about what he was going to say, because I knew he was going to say something, because he held on longer than he normally did. And he said to me, he said, "Well, Pastor, I guess I won't tell you that it's okay, but I will tell you that you're worth waiting for." And I've never forgotten that moment, how special it was, how gracious it was. I got to tell that story at his funeral. Even after I'd left the congregation, was invited back to share a little bit. He just embodied the kind of slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love that I needed in that moment. And I believe that is one of the best examples I have of a God who sees us messing up in big and small ways and just doesn't give up on us, just says you're worth waiting for. And so, in as much as God is with those who are on the underside, I believe God, when we work for justice, and we're talking about the forces that are opposed to one another, oppression, I believe we have to have faith in that God who still thinks we're worth waiting for. We're not a lost cause, especially those of us who find ourselves more in sync with the forces and the work of privilege in the world, which is where I find myself in. Those are the rooms I'm usually in too. So God being for humanity and creation. And then finally, I'm going to try and going to share my screen again. I'm going to show the taskbar. Figure out why this isn't working right now. Can you see? Oh, we're back. Okay, we're back, everybody. I'm going to share my screen again. I might not share. Let's see the current slide. I'm going to share it this way because I don't want to lose that again. And then just that God is love. So that's the last sort of central conviction of my faith for today. If I had to do this tomorrow or the next day, I might add to this. That love is subversive, that it's an upside down love. We just had the Beatitudes for All Saints Sunday, with Jesus stating his mission at the beginning of Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, release to the captives, freedom for those who are bound, sight to the blind, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That there's this perpetual, that activity, this project of God is pretty dynamic in trying to turn it upside down. That the most visible ways of God's love are often and most often in not the spectacular and glorious, which are wonderful, but in the mundane and the ordinary. That's how close that love is to us, and that it is most powerful in our vulnerability and beyond vulnerability to those times when we're deeply suffering. That the most intimate closeness of God is Jesus on the cross, and that the way that God shows God's love is in that solidarity with us. So those convictions of faith, I hope it'll be easy to sort of see how with those convictions, I can't really separate a life that is very intent and bound to working for justice and peace. So the working definition I have about justice starts here with those biblical references to the word justice, which mean to make right. First and foremost, it's a relational term. It's people living in right relationship with God, with one another, and all creation. From a scriptural point of view, justice means loving our neighbor as we love ourselves and is rooted in the character and nature of God. As God is just and loving, so we are called to do justice and live in love. So that's, if I have to tell somebody, what do you mean when you say justice? That's the working definition that I have. But I have some others that you've probably heard as well, which is justice is what love looks like in public. That's Cornell West, and making sure to connect how the church is always willing, or hopefully always willing, to talk about love. When he says justice, he's going to make us grapple with the reality that that's still love. It's just love happening in public. That publicness of God gets us to why I believe faith is essentially, and that's an important word, it is essentially political. And what I mean by political is that the most neutral way we think about political. And our culture has taken this word political and really made it mean a lot of other things that I'm still trying hard, and maybe I won't win this battle, but I'm still trying hard to keep it much more neutral so that we can say we are political and not be ashamed or apologetic about that. So political is about making agreements between people so they can live together in groups such as tribes, cities, or countries. So like that, I mean, that's just the biggest, most basic definition. It's about making agreements between people so that they can live together in groups. I think about like a first grade classroom, the students, what are their unspoken agreements about how they're going to live together, all those 6-year-olds for a whole school year. That's political. I mean, so we are engaged in political from the very, very beginning, unless we live completely isolated from everyone else. Of course, politics, politicians and other people may get together to form things called governments, which are the set of activities associated with making decisions in groups, forms of power relations among individuals, and really is concerned with the distribution of resources. So that political public faith and God's insistence on our worthiness gets me to this word of enoughness. Some ways I think about justice as enoughness. That comes out in the fact that first I hear God telling me and us that we are enough. And then I hear God telling us, you have enough. And those are some of the most rebellious words in a capitalist, in the United States. I mean, everything around me tries to tell me I'm not enough and I don't have enough. And I mean, every ad, just the way everything is put together. And so we are, if we're living as Christians in this culture, we are over against that culture in proclaiming this enoughness in the eyes of God. And then going so far, taking it one step further. So I think some people can get around, sure, that's how God is, but then there's the world's ways. And so we have to do the world's ways as much as we have to believe how God thinks about us. And they just hold those things as, well, this is God over here, and then this is the world over here. I, of course, believe that what God says to us is supposed to be transformative, and then would transform us into actually saying to each other, we are enough and we have enough. And if that is true, then that has implications for how we live our lives and for the ways we participate in the public sphere. So this is my own word. If faith is God not giving up on us, then justice feels like us not giving up on each other. That we will continue to figure out the ways that we can work for each other's good and wholeness, and that is justice. I'm going to stop here. There's still a little more I'd like to share. In fact, yeah, there's still a portion of the project, but I'd like to hear some of your thoughts. What are you thinking right now? Just give us some time to unpack a little bit of what I've said and have us interact with each other. So who has some thoughts, or questions are okay at this point, but I'm really more interested in how this is landing on you right now. You could just unmute yourself and start talking. Hopefully you're comfortable enough in the group to do that.
Hi, Libby. This is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Your story about Leslie's hands and heart were so moving and memorable for me. And it seems like he was saying, you're worth waiting for. And that's another way of saying, I'm not giving up on you. And so do you see, so I'm just thinking, was that an act of justice on an act of broadening justice in his world, was to include the pastor in a circle of forgiveness, right? Or in a circle of grace, or in a circle of acceptance and love. And so it's interesting to your experience. That was kind of like the rock in the pond, and then the ripples out from that is that if you have had that experience with Leslie, you get to share that with other people in your life, to tell them that they're worth waiting for, and they're worth fighting for, even, I would say, in terms of when we're working within oppressive systems. It's not just waiting around, right? There's some bending of the arc towards justice that we're asked to engage in. And so those are some of the thoughts that are coming up for me.
Thank you. Yeah, and in that, very personal sort of a psychological breakdown there of, clearly I wasn't feeling like a great pastor in those moments, right? I mean, I did not feel like enough. And he told me I was. So that even in that sort of sense of justice, how that happens interpersonally, can translate into how we think about doing this work in the world. And we'll talk a little bit about more. I'm going to hang on to and ask folks to remember the image you used of the ark, because that's going to come up. That's going to come up a little later too. So thanks for that reflection. Other thoughts? You're worth waiting for. Hi,
Libby, hi. I don't know if this speaks to you or not, but whenever I think about Jesus, I think about some of the progressive Christians who have written about their faith and about him. And I think about Marcus Borg and how we are all given broad brushstrokes of Jesus's way of living, so that we can live through him. And I think of one book called Saving Jesus from the Church, which is, you seem like you're familiar with it, but the basic premise is we put him in stained glass windows, and then we walk out the door and go on with our lives. And the church wants to say that we have the say about him, but Jesus probably wouldn't go that far. So in my own personal reflections, I think about Jesus as following him with Matthew 25, and try not to get so caught up in being saved, but try to get more into just following him.
Thank you. There's another book called When Bad Christians Happen to Good People. Same sort of title, same kind of ideas. Just it's how to be self-reflective about who we are as the church and as Christians in the world, and how Jesus is related to all of that. It's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts that folks would like to offer?
I thought your definition of justice about us not giving up on each other was just sort of something to reflect on, because I think it's easy to just give up on people as hopeless. They're never going to see the light. They're never going to come around. And just staying open with all sides. That's justice work, staying in the conversation and staying in the relationship. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, or recommend I can just do that now, actually. There is an author named Anand Giridharadas, and he has written a book called, make sure I can get it here, called The Persuaders. And I will, but there's a link to a podcast that I'm going to put in the chat. So if you want to click it right now and then have it to look at later, so it pulls the window up on your screen. This is a Brene Brown podcast. You can, thanks Michelle for that too. Have you read that book, The Persuaders? Yeah, it's fascinating. He is an second generation immigrant. He shares his experience of immigration in the US and in France and compares the two, believes that this country is embarking and has been embarking on ideally, there is a nugget worth saving of the ideals of democracy and the real potential that we have, this experiment, this idea that anybody from anywhere can come to this place and be fully a part of it. Which really resists what may be, and some of that is because we're still a pretty young country, but really resists what I think some would call, some have named as, nativism. He describes like when he grew up in France, he's like, when we were immigrants in France, we knew that even though we were citizens and we could do all the things a citizen did, we were never French. We never became of France in the way that we have that possibility and that conceptualization. And I feel, I love that his is a voice out there that is still holding out that when people think about, I mean, even despite what we're putting on display for the world right now as a country, when people think about what's possible and what could be here, they still have that hopefulness. And so sometimes I've felt pretty hopeless when it comes to how we are regressing and or we're just showing who we've always been, I suppose, is another way to say that. And the curtain, the revelation is happening, which, by the way, is the word that apocalypse is from, is revelation, right? So to say we're in an apocalyptic moment is actually true, but careful who you say it to, make sure they know what you mean. By the revealing, the uncovering of what's going on, the possibility we have in this moment to see the truth, the best truths and the worst truths about ourselves, and make decisions about what to do. And we don't know right now how that's going to go. I mean, and Jim, we mentioned that anxiety, that fear. I think it's in that not knowing what it will mean, that we see right now our propensity for destruction, and it scares us, and it should, because there's absolutely nothing guaranteeing that we won't do that. And I feel like that living with that truth is difficult. It is anxiety producing. And so that faith, wherever we can draw on the faith of ourselves or the faith of others, we must, because that's real stuff. And there's nothing that's going to convince me of those realities not being true. And the election was one of the best examples of that. I mean, I'm relieved that Tony Evers was reelected, but I can't believe that the one thread, how thin the thread is for democracy in this state to continue in any sort of real way, now that we don't have any sort of understanding beyond partisanship that a party should be working for the good of the whole instead of just the people that agree with them. That's just such a profound different way that I don't see changing anytime soon. So, but Anand Giridharadas, back to this book, he follows activists around, people who've been doing the work of justice and peace for their whole lives. And he follows them around for 2 years and starts to learn about what they do, how they do it. And the whole premise is that we don't give up on people. We do whatever we can to keep the relationship going. It doesn't mean we agree with them. It doesn't even mean we agree to disagree. That's a phrase we hear a lot sometimes. What it means is we hold fast to who we are, and who we are people that believe we can change. We believe in transformation. We believe that a person can be impacted by another person, and that while that may just look like the brickest wall there ever was, they refuse to give up, and they do that together so that they strengthen each other in that refusal and giving up. So I think that book has given me a ton of hope recently. Just there are people, and they may not be related even to church, but the faith they have in humanity, the belief they have that people can change and will and have. And then he even gives examples of how that's happened in our own country. He says, I don't think we recognize the massive shifts that have even taken place in our own country. He's talked specifically about men and the ways 50 years ago men learned what it meant to be a good man, and what were the ways of being male, and how radically that has changed, and how fast we're asking for that shift to happen. So he talks about how it affects people emotionally and psychologically, which is really important when it comes to how we think about what's possible in terms of policy. What kinds of mind and heart shifts have to happen. And sometimes those happen before policy, and sometimes policy moves those mind and heart shifts. It's not always one before the other. But he just raises that up and says, we need to give ourselves just this larger scope of what we're asking of people to do when we say we're who you are and who you think you've always been, and what you think makes you matter doesn't anymore. And how tightly people will cling then to the identities and to the ways of self-definition they've had their whole lives. And the church has certainly things to speak about that in terms of identity and worthiness. So that book, The Persuaders, and listen to the podcast with Brene Brown. It's a two-parter. She interviews him, so you get to hear him speak. He was just really inspiring about that. I'm going to go back and make sure we can get through a couple other things. Let's share my screen again here. What is it like, and this is sort of where I am now, so we're sort of moving into the current situation, however we sort of define that, but I think I've given you an idea of the precariousness of it. And what I used to think is it was all going to be better. And now I actually believe that it's the first time in my own life as a 47-year-old that I'm looking toward my own lifespan and seeing that now the things that I'm working toward and working for, I absolutely, barring some incredible event or whatever, I absolutely don't believe I'll see the results of or the end of. And so faith has taken on a different thing. Like, well, when you don't believe that you'll see results, when you don't believe the goal will be reached, and that you'll get to experience that, how do you work for justice? What is faith then? And that's what took me to this. Faith is now the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And this verse has taken on a new life for me as I consider what I just shared about my own life and about just the long road ahead. Now that this revelation is happening, I think my life will be lived in the apocalyptic era, at least this first apocalyptic era of the United States. I don't think I'll see the next one, that I will be a part of this one that deconstructs and that messes with and that is really, really challenging and mean. I think we're in this for the long haul for a while. It doesn't mean I'm completely. And so then the question is, what is hope in that? Because faith and hope are often spoken of even synonymously. but what do we mean then if faith is the foundation of the work and of the motivation to do the work of justice and peace? What part does hope play? And I have recently been introduced to a theologian named Reverend, or not Reverend, Dr. Miguel de la Torre. He is a professor of social ethics and Latinx studies at the ILIF School of Theology. And I came upon a video shared by a friend, and he talks about a theology of hopelessness. And I'm going to ask us to listen to this for about 6 minutes, and then sort of to give you a taste of where he's coming from with this, especially as a Latinx person. And we will do that. So I need to stop this share so I can share that video. I'm going to go to this one. We have it optimized. I'm going to open it up. Will somebody tell me that you can see this? I can't see you right now.
Can see it so far.
Okay, so I'm gonna play it, and hopefully you'll.
Buenas noches. I took a group of students with me to Cuernavaca in Mexico for the purpose of learning from the poor and learning about who God is. That evening, when we began to unpack what we saw, one of the students looked at me and said, I know they're struggling. I know it's horrible, a lot of suffering. But when I looked into the eyes of that little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes. Now, at that moment, I had an epistemological meltdown. And what I responded, maybe not very pastoral, was, I'm not sure what you saw in her eyes, but in 5 years, she's going to be turning tricks to put food on the table. She will be in poverty, her children will be in poverty, and her children's children will be in poverty. There's a generational suffering, and you imposing hope upon her saves you from your responsibility and your connection to why she lives in poverty. Because of our global economic structure, she lives in poverty, and you living in the first world benefits by her poverty. Not very pastoral. I have come to learn that hope is a way of maintaining oppression among those who suffer the most. Hope becomes a way of domesticating those who are suffering. When I went to Auschwitz, it's a sign above the gate that says, work will set you free. It provides hope for those walking through those gates. But no, and if you walk through those gates, you might believe that if I keep my eyes down, if I don't say anything, if I try not to stir the pot, maybe I'll survive. But the end result is the same. You'll probably end up in the gas chambers. You see, hope of maybe surviving allows me or constricts me not to make waves, not to do the radical praxis that is needed in order to bring about liberation. Now, what I'm saying is counterintuitive. I mean, after all, the gifts of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, and hope, and here I am talking against hope. But if I'm going to be in radical solidarity with the very least of these, my brethren, they're the ones that are sitting in the Saturday, not knowing if a Sunday resurrection would occur. And for me to sit with them and start saying, all things work for good for those who are called according to God's purposes, is not only disingenuous, but it really is lost in any type of translation. Now, my problem is that I don't hope in English. I hope in Spanish. See, in Spanish, hope is esperanza, which is from the root word esperar, which means to wait. You see, we Latinos realize that to esperar, esperanza, means that we're waiting, but we're not sure what we're waiting for. It could be good or it could be bad. So we are just esperando. And this ambiguity of hope, which I think the English language loses, is what I'm trying to grasp in the work that I am doing. Hope seems to only work if we narrow it down to the personal. I'm sure you've been to some church where some pastor says something about a little girl on the beach after a storm, and there's a bunch of starfishes, and she's throwing each one back one by one, and there's a grumpy old man on the beach, and he says, you can't save them all, and she picks one up and says, I'll save this one, and throws it back, and we go, okay. I'm the grumpy old man on the beach, okay? Because what I'm seeing is the carnage of all the dead starfish. But as long as I could put one on a pedestal and said, one made it out of the barrio, one made it out of the concentration camp, one made it out, and one made it, then I could ignore the thousands of dead bodies that are on that beach. And I apologize, but the stench of rotting flesh has been so much that it has choked any hope out of me. If I'm going to be in solidarity, I have to be in solidarity with those thousands of starfish. So a little theological now. I think the problem with hope is that we have bought into Hegel's dialectical history, that somehow history is moving in such a way that you can see God's hand in it, and it's moving in an upward way. We call this a salvation history. We see this in both capitalism, that, at the end of history, a rising tide lifts all ships. And we see it in Marxism, that we're going to wither away the state, everybody's going to live in utopia. Salvation history is a product of the whole modernity project. I've been perverted by Foucault in where he instead talks that there is no linear dialectical history. That is, things could be going great today. Next generation, we could go back to Jim and Jane Crow, we could go back to slavery, or we could go to a more enlightened. It depends on each generation and what they do with their time. So if there is no, and I love Martin Luther King, and I apologize, but I think he's wrong when he says that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I argue there is no arc. And it could bend towards justice or injustice just as easily. But if I believe that there's a dialectical history, then I could have hope that it's all going to work out. You see what I'm saying? And I think Moltmann is trying to make this point of learning from the poor and learning about who God is. That evening, when we began to unpack what we saw, one of the students looked at me and said,
We lost your audio.
How about now?
There we go. You're on.
All I did was mute myself and unmute myself. No idea. So I've listened to that about 3 times now. There's much more to it. So I will also put the link to that in the notes or in the chat here. When I first heard it, the reason it really hit me was precisely because of what he says about Martin Luther King Jr. and that arc of justice, because I love that image. And I love the idea of, and what I really picture when I think of that is the St. Louis Arch. But I picture it, and I didn't even realize I did that, but I'm like, what you're picturing is one side down in the ground and the rest of it up, like it hasn't been put down yet. And that the only way for it to come down is for enough people to hang off the end of it and keep bending it toward the ground, that we would finally get it there. And I love to think of myself as one of those people, that I'm one of those people hanging off that arc, trying to bend it toward justice, and that I'm, collectively doing that with others. And it's resistant. I mean, that you could think about how it would spring, right? And then the resistance that it would give. I'm not completely ready to give up that there is no ark. I'm just, or salvation history or what he said. But he has, what he says about the way we can domesticate hope, I think is really significant. And like I said, I invite you to watch the rest of it too. But I want, now that I've shared him with you, what are some of your, what's percolating in you about that? Because he really plays with this hope and hopelessness. And I, in my ordination, took a vow to not, I mean, the one that comes across my brain that sort of surfaces most often is not to give people illusory hope. That is one of my ordination vows, that I don't tell people it's going to be better if I don't know that, that I have to sit with them in the not knowing of that. And that's tough in a world that wants everything to be better, and in a Disney Hollywood world. So what are your thoughts about Dr. De La Torre?
That's like when we read one of the prophetic texts in worship and then say, the word of the Lord, and the response is like, thanks be to God. I think that's profound to talk, just the way he articulated hope being oppressive. I had never thought of, but the illustration of Auschwitz is gut punching.
I just posted the link to the article in Spectrum magazine that has that links to that video. He was presented with an award for his work. He's written prolifically. He really is, I think, a voice to listen to right now. What are other thoughts folks had as you were hearing him? What did you think about the starfish illustration that he undid?
There goes another good sermon illustration.
Another one bites the dust.
Another one bites the dust.
As I listened to this, I was reminded of my work. I spent a number of years working with the homeless in inner city Milwaukee. And one of the very first lessons I learned was you don't tell them it's going to be okay. You don't look at them and expect them to be hopeful, but rather to say, what is it you need today? What can we do right now? And I think that hope becomes a balm for many of us who are removed from the day-to-day trials of those who suffer the biggest injustices in our society. So I can't wait to get to the rest of his presentation. I could really identify this based on my experiences in the past, where your heart wants to say to someone who's really hurting, it's going to be okay, when you have no way on earth of knowing if it's going to be okay or not. So that really, really spoke to me. Thank you, Reverend Howell.
One of the things this has challenged me to think really deeply about is preaching. I mean, you mentioned, Jim, about a sermon illustration biting the dust, but the trajectory of preaching has often been, that law gospel, preach the, drive them to the cross and then pull them from the grave in 15 minutes or less. And I feel like, you got to figure that out, because if we have whole generations of people believing that we can be in solidarity, we can be in the death and the darkness and the tomb, and then it's just all magically going to get better, which is, I think, a lot of what sermons sometimes sound like, especially if they wrap up with, there's this in the Black church, there's a way that when the preacher says, but Jesus, you know, like says all of the things that are true about, and then goes, but Jesus, you know, and it's not that I don't think that's true, but it's like, we have to face, I just don't want to play I don't want to play with those who are struggling in a way that it always makes me feel more comfortable, and it hasn't done anything for those who are actually hurting. And yet I believe in the comfort of scripture, so those tensions are real when it comes to how we preach, how we teach about this, and why perhaps the church has been okay with being as distant as it has been for so many years from those who suffer most, and really doesn't think it's that, you know, an over spiritualized salvation even, or liberation that has been very divorced from real suffering.
I think the place that I felt was his very opening story of, oh, I saw hope in that little girl's eyes. And then he said, and it takes you off the hook. And I just thought, you know, that's part of what I want to do. And it convicted me, you know, it was like, okay. And that's the challenge. And then he went on to really unpack that even further. It is the challenge that we have in my own personal life. I'll just start there, is how not to take myself off the hook by that kind of hope language that ignores the reality.
One of the scriptures that he quotes is from Romans. All things work together for good. And it's actually from my favorite chapter of Romans, which is Romans 8. It's not too long after. In fact, it's in the same sort of section as Paul's, you know, making this argument that he says, one of the verses that we're all very familiar with, and that I wanted to, I'm gonna get here from, go back to this, share. One of the things that he says nearer the end is this. So this, those of you who might be inclined to not listen to the rest of what he has to say, is this. And the paper concludes with a term I have coined in other books, an ethics parahode, an ethics that screws with. And actually, you'll see it's sort of a funny moment in the talk, because it's, in English, it's actually more okay to say screws with than it is parahode in Spanish, which means something much more crude. Anyway, when all is hopeless, he says, when neoliberalism has won, when there exists no chance of establishing justice, the only choice left for the oppressed, and implicitly those who stand with them, is to screw with the structure, turning over the bankers' tables at the temple. We struggle regardless of hopelessness, because the struggle defines our humanity. And that, I mean, I get a little bit of goosebumps there, because he didn't get me off the hook with it, but he still told me that there's purpose in the struggle. It's not a message. His theology, or his message of the theology of hopelessness, is not hopeless for humanity. That we have the opportunity to define what it means for us to be humans with each other. And like he said, generation to generation can decide that either way. In doing so, this is the book I mentioned. This is author Anand Giridharadas. The Persuaders is that book. And I have a lot to learn. I'm actually listening to it right now. I have not even finished it. So I'm always a little nervous about, you know, but he has made me so, I'm not nervous at all about recommending it. I think it's tremendously useful, even though I haven't completely finished it. And then this verse, and this is the verse I'll end with. And I thought, why did you want to end with that? Are you trying to get them off the hook? Are you trying to make them feel comfortable before we leave together? And I thought, no, I'm not, because I don't hear this verse in the same way. I don't hear these verses doing that. I hear these verses calling us in to the struggle and the hopelessness and the humanity of working for justice, more than giving us comfort to stay out of it. And it is these verses. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And that is the ultimate faith statement that can animate our work for justice. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Libby. I think you've succeeded in making us uncomfortable, which I think is really part of our purpose.
But do you also feel like you're worth it?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
I hope you feel encouraged as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. So much. It has been a pleasure to have you today, sharing that, and just to hear those words of challenge and encouragement today. So thank you. And I'll turn it back to you, Audrey, as we close out today.
Thank you to everyone who attended today. As I said earlier, please feel free to give us any feedback that you have on the program. Thank you very much, Reverend Howe. It was a very energizing and intriguing presentation. If anyone is interested in becoming part of our group, we meet the second Wednesday of each month at 8:30 in the morning. And you are certainly welcome to join us. We have no rigid requirements about who attends our meetings, so please feel welcome. Today in closing, I'm going to ask Reverend Michelle Heinrichs to close us.
Let us pray. God, who is with us, when you created us a diverse humanity, you never intended that we would use it against one another. But here we are. Maybe you knew we would always be at odds with each other, creating factions and divisions where you see only your beloved children. Help us to be able to do the same. We give you thanks for continuing to lead us in our wilderness. God, who is for us, you taught, healed, and loved everyone. Even those you rebuked, you did not cast away. You sat with us in our suffering. You endure in your loving work of reconciliation with the hope that we would be one body within your kingdom. May it be so. We give you thanks for continuing to pursue us. God, who dwells within us, your winds of truth still blow, and your tongues of fire still refine and renew us. As you hovered over the waters of chaos, you beheld the beauty of what would be created. May we seek the beauty rather than the base. We give you thanks for continuing to breathe hope in the world. God of faith and justice, we have gathered today seeking words of truth and challenge. Thank you for Reverend Howe and her wisdom. As we look to you to bring order to our disordered world, we also hear your call to join you in your work of reconciliation. In the strength of our faith, give us courage for this moment. In the strength of your love, give us hope for the future. For the good of your people and the glory of your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Michelle, and thank you everyone for being here.
Blessings to all.
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Of course.
Okay, so I work with Wisconsin Council of Churches. I love to go out to congregations and preach. I do some coaching and consulting. So I put my contact information there. Would love to be a part, especially of any ecumenical work that you're doing to lift up the work of peace and justice in your areas. But I'm doing everything I can to try to get out beyond my own this little place that I live in. So don't be shy about calling or writing. And thank you again for the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. By all, blessings be still.